everyone, welcome to Pit Stops at Podium, the RevPartners podcast where we talk to execs who've competed and won, taking their companies from high growth to high scale. My name is Brendan Tollison. I serve as the co-founder and CEO of RevPartners, and I'm delighted to have with me today Mor Assouline for this episode of Pit Stops to Podium. Welcome, Mor.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, we're excited to have you. Mor, this is going to be a really fun episode as we get into how to run effective demos. But for those who may not be familiar with Mor, Mor is the founder at From Demo to Close, otherwise known as FDTC. And Mor, this is a great opportunity, I think, for you to share a little bit more about FDTC, as well as the origin story. How did you come up with the idea? What gave you the expertise or the background to say, hey, this is what I want to pursue?
Yeah, absolutely. So From Demo to Close is a consulting, advising, training, coaching program I have like the B2B service side. So I work with early stage startups, founders for go-to-market sales. So building out sales playbooks, improving sales processes, people, etc. And then there's another leg to the business, which is the university. It's my coaching program, specifically built out for account executives. Every week we meet once a week on Zoom. There's Slack, there's course content, there's material, there's resources. So I'm like their virtual coach over Zoom, but we meet once a week. So that's what the business is. So it's specifically for B2B SaaS. The origin of this is so the business has been around for about 2 years. Prior to that, I was a VP of sales for a couple of SaaS startups. And prior to that, I actually, my first job out of college was a sales job, and I quit the first day. That was way back when.
First day. What happened?
I didn't like sales. I was scared. It was a cold calling job. I needed a job, took the job, got the interview, did well in the interview, and then I've never really done cold calls, and then I just freaked out, just total cold feet. And then I told the founder, I'm like, I'm so sorry. Sales isn't for me. And funny enough, sales is for me. And so got back into it after doing cold calling and door knocking as a realtor at Keller Williams, and then got into tech sales over 10 years ago. And then I've been there ever since. And so all the companies that I've worked for, they've all been, they're not like Salesforce or Oracle, these big names. So it wasn't as easy to sell because nobody's heard of the companies before. So you had to get really creative on how to sell. And that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity because then that's where you build out your sales skills. But majority of the revenue that we've closed came from the demos that we gave, meaning you had to give a demo in order for them to see the value, in order for them to close. Even some of them were like some PLG companies. And so that means I had to get really good at doing demos. And then when I hired, I had to get really good at training reps to do demos. And I did that multiple times where the worst salesperson on the team closed 50% of their demos. The best salesperson closing between like 70, 75% of their demos. And when I launched my business, it was specifically focused on demos. But then the truth is, demos don't close on the one call. They close after the call. It takes time if it's mid-market or enterprise. So the entire business is predicated on how to do demos, but really how to actually move deals forward via discovery, preparation, multi-threading, building up playbooks. So that's the origin. Now I'm here.
Oh, I'm excited to dive into that topic because there's a lot to unpack there, especially for our audience. And it's a fascinating story in terms of quitting your first day because you were worried about cold calling and now seeing what you're doing for your career. So that's a fun, full story. Well, more before we get into understanding some of those actual insights that our audience can take around how to be effective at running demos, would love to just learn the personal side of you. What are those passions, hobbies, interests that you have when you're not helping B2B SaaS organizations?
Yeah, I like this question because you probably don't get this response as a common response. When I'm not working, I'm working. I enjoy working. It's a hobby of mine. I really enjoy it. And what that looks like, it may not be like doing coaching calls, but it is probably writing content on LinkedIn. I love writing content. I love copywriting. I used to be a copywriter before I even got into sales. I worked at Zimmerman Advertising, which is one of the largest in Florida. And so I'm copywriting, I'm reading, I'm rarely just doing nothing. So my passion, work, I guess.
What is the last book you read? Could be work or could be for fun. Well, it sounds like that's for fun for you, but what do you read or what would you recommend our audience to read?
Yeah. So if you're in sales, you should study psychology and copywriting. I think you find a lot of things in there because it taps into human psychology. But I'm rereading now. I've just reread Expert Secrets from Russell Brunson, and then Traffic Secrets just came in the mail. So I'm just starting to read that. It's more so like tapping into. I'm big into marketing. I'm probably a marketer trapped in a salesperson's body, which I think could make me a good salesperson because of that. But that's what I'm reading now.
That's great. All right. Well, Mor, let's since your passion is work, let's talk about work.
Let's get into it.
What you're passionate about. Well, there are a lot of things within. You mentioned messaging and marketing, but ultimately supporting sales teams, and that demo being a critical part of determining success or failure within that sales engagement, really driving that. I don't know if you actually, it's a debatable question, is a demo an SQL or an MQL, but really driving it from sales interaction to close, making sure that conversion rate is high. Let's start here. Before we get into what makes a great demo, how do you, like, for reps or SDRs or anything about sales teams, is discovery and demo separate, or are they part of the same conversation, or can you do both? How do you think through that?
I hate using this answer because it's an annoying answer, but it depends. So it depends on, are you SMB? If you're SMB, then I think majority of the time it should be combined. When I say majority, I mean like all of the time. You have your outliers where you'll separate them because the discovery went really well and really deep, where you don't have time to do a demo, and then you schedule a secondary demo or secondary follow-up. That's a demo. So SMB should always be disco demo combined, always, in my opinion. When you're getting into more mid-market enterprise, then you can make the strong debate that, hey, you can split them, or you can combine them, but you should always prioritize discovery. So if you typically do disco demo in one, if you're an enterprise or mid-market, and you're not done yet with it, like the discovery is really deep, the prospect is really engaging and he's answering the questions, don't rush out of discovery so you can do the demo. So in that case, I would say separate them. But short answer, SMB, combine them. Mid-market, enterprise, there's no wrong answer, really. It really depends on where the conversation is going. I think it also really depends on if your website has a book a demo or schedule a demo, the buyer expects to see a demo. So if you start that call is really only a discovery. You're not aligning to what the buyer's expectations are, which you lose the buyer on. You lose your trust, credibility. So give them a demo, give them something.
Yeah. I think it gets back to your marketing perspective. Like, hey, be consistent with whatever your messaging is.
Exactly.
What you experience as the buyer. Okay, I think it's helpful. I'm also curious to hear your perspective on who is responsible. We can maybe get that later, but I think it probably depends on. Oftentimes, I've seen this, probably because I've been more mid-market and above, but as a sales engineer responsible, as a rep responsible, I think there's always sometimes that lack of ownership creates a really poor experience. But maybe we'll get into that in just a second. But what makes a great demo versus a poor demo?
I'll give you a perfect analogy, metaphor. What was the last movie you watched in theaters?
Theaters. Well, the last movie, it's been a very, very long time. So I'll go with, I have 3 little kids, so it's hard for me to go to the theater. The last movie I watched was Remember the Titans with my wife, because she has never seen it before.
That is a long, long time ago.
Well, no, that's not the last movie I saw in the theaters. That's the last movie I watched. Okay. Yeah, that would be very sad if that was the last movie I saw in the theater. That was like 2002.
I was like, whoa. What was...
I'm killing your metaphor now.
Yeah. What was the last movie you watched that you never watched before?
Last movie I saw in theaters was Top Gun.
Maverick.
Yeah.
Not the original Top Gun.
Yeah, not the original. Yeah. Good distinction.
All right. Let me ask you a question. When you went to see the movie in theaters, was that the first time you've watched it somewhat, or did you watch a trailer in advance?
Trailer in advance.
So that is what the demo is. It's the trailer, not the movie. So what makes a great demo is it's specific enough to the buyer where they can walk away from it saying, wow, this can solve my problem. Not how it can solve it. Like, this is exactly can solve my problem. The movie itself, the actual full movie is the prospect becoming the buyer and the customer, and that's the onboarding and the training. So a great demo is like a trailer. It's not too long. It's long enough to get the prospect to know exactly what they need and to align it to their problems, and it's short enough where they want more of it. So that means demos shouldn't be too long, because then you get prospect burnout. So in order to do that, you need to prioritize discovery, And the way I used to say when I used to sell software, I tell buyers, I'd say like, hey, Brendan, my number one goal is to show you how to solve your biggest problems in the shortest period of time. And that's what I'm going to show you today. And that means if you have one main problem, and I have I have a software with 50 features, but out of the 50 features, there are only 2 in there that can solve that one problem. That's what I'm demoing. I'm not demoing the 49, 48 others.
Why? Yeah, I love that. I don't know if it's a metaphor or analogy. And I'm glad I gave you one that was in the theaters and not just Remember the Titans, because that really wouldn't have worked.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I think people get it, but they also still fall into the temptation to show them everything. But you get to that point, less is more. Focus on the 3 things that people will buy. Why do reps struggle with why don't they do that?
For many reasons. One, their discovery is too shallow, and so when they do a discovery, they ask 1 or 2 questions. Maybe they don't ask enough questions, and they start the demo. They don't know where to navigate because they don't have reference to navigate. They don't have the paint to navigate, not enough of it. And so like, oh, let me start showing you the dashboard and the settings, and then they just go through the demo. That's one reason. Number 2, it's maybe their managers or whatever. If they're working in like a early stage company where there's a founder only, the founder is really gung ho about their product and really excited, and they're like, you got to show them this. This is where it's at, and that's not really relevant. And so they're following orders, or they were trained to do it that way. And so sometimes it's all 3.
I like that. I mean, it speaks into you truly need to understand your customer. And there are a lot of reasons why people don't, whether that's because of poor discovery or poor training by the manager.
Poor discovery is a very, very. It's like one of the most common things, even in companies that have sales enablement built out. The discovery is just not there.
Yeah, and I would love to also unpack another topic, which is, so there's some of these things internally that they can control, right? In terms of process enablement, how to run effective discoveries. But there's also like, how do you manage personalities? And so that's more the external piece. But as you're talking to reps and coaching them, how should they be mindful of the buyer that they're talking to? And how should they not only tailor it in terms of the need the business has, but also just the personality of the person they're talking to?
Yeah, so that's probably where like the marketing head comes in and how I think about it. And so I think every company should have this sort of baked in, and many don't, and they only have it for sales if they do have it. But buyer persona. So what are the titles? You should have a buyer persona matrix, which is the title, the role of the prospect, what their dislikes are on a professional level, and then what their dislikes are on a personal level, what triggers them, what they like really like write it out. For example, if you're selling to a CEO or an SVP, what they dislike is maybe long-winded answers. They just like get to the point. And so maybe storytelling is not an ideal strategy to use with that type of buyer. But potentially you'd have to map it out for your own buyer persona. For example, if you're selling software to an antiquated industry like construction, then you know that a founder of a construction company, it could be like a mid-market construction company, may not be as tech savvy, and they don't like when you get too complex. They like things simple. So that's part 1, buyer persona. Then what I'd recommend is you build out a buying scenario matrix, which is what is the use case and where the buyer persona is. For example, let's say you're selling, again, we'll use construction tech. You're selling to construction workers or construction founders, whatever it is, and that's the buyer persona. Well, what's their use case? What's the buying scenario? Are they coming from a competitor, or are they coming from no solution? Or are they coming from an antiquated solution, like maybe they're just using QuickBooks or Excel? So if they're coming from a competitor, that comes with its own baggage, FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So if they're coming from a competitor, one of their concerns that they have in their mind that's top of mind is feature parity. Do you offer the same features that I like in my current solution? Can you mimic that? 2, can you migrate all of my data? If not, that's a problem. 3, are you are you cheaper than my product? Are you more expensive than my product? 4, how easy is it to use? Because my team has already been using this software for 4 years and they're used to it. If I migrate over to you, how quick is the onboarding and the product adoption? So every buyer persona has their own buying scenario. And within each buying scenario, there's these own triggers and psychology that you have to speak to. And so what I'd recommend for reps to get like really tap into that is study the buyer persona and the buying scenarios. And when you're doing a discovery call, one of the questions like, hey, let's say it's an inbound lead. Hey, what are some challenges that you're dealing with that you think that we can help with? prospect says, well, we're currently using X. Now you immediately know that that is a buyer persona within the buying scenario of migrating from competitor. If you've done your homework and you've memorized it, you know what triggers them, what they like, what they dislike, how you should align your entire demo around that buying scenario.
I really like the framework of the persona and the buyer scenario, because I think to your point, it gives the rep a roadmap and confidence to know, hey, if I hear these things, here's how I connect that or tie that to the solution that we have, which gets into kind of that discovery you just talked about. Is oftentimes they don't know how to solve, they don't understand the root cause or root problem because they don't have that context or know where to go next with the question, either because they don't have experience or they haven't been trained from their manager.
In ClickFunnels, I just reread it right now. Traffic Secrets are one of them. It was talking about how you should have like landing pages for each stage of your buyer. So you have top funnel, mid funnel, and bottom funnel. Top funnel, nobody really knows who you are. So your landing pages has to have a different headline. It can't be the name of your product. It has to be more about the problem. If people know who you are and your problem, then your landing page for that audience should just be about your product itself, not the actual problem, because they already know who you are. So that's why copywriting and marketing is so aligned to sales.
Yeah. And I think, as we kind of transition the last topic for today, I think you probably already hit some of it in terms of the scenario, the questions to be mindful of. But as we have potential managers or reps thinking through, hey, how do I increase my win rate or close rate in terms of the demo being effective? I know you have a 24-part question that we'll offer to our audience as a follow-up to this. But maybe let's go through some of those of, hey, here's 3 things that I'd recommend in terms of questions you should be asking. And maybe you can tailor to your point about buyer scenario. But that might be helpful for our audience just to start rethinking how they do their demo process.
So I'll give you like 3 very tactical things that you can do on a demo to increase the win rate. Before the first thing is before you show, let's assume that you're only going to show the feature that solves the pain. Let's say that before you show a particular feature, don't just jump straight to the feature. I call it a PSF framework. So you bring up the pain, that's for the P. So you talk about the prospect pain. How do you do that? How do you do that? How do you do that tactically? Hey, Brennan, earlier you mentioned that you're having blank, blank, blank problem and it's causing blank, blank, blank issues. So that you bring up the pain. It's not for you, it's for the prospect to make them lean in and be like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm having. So you mentioned you're having this problem. What I'm about to show you will help you solve that problem in X period of time. And then I'm going to share the feature. So once I share the feature, I want to see how aligned based on what I just showed them, how aligned is that to their pain. So I show the feature, I end the feature, I'll say, hey, Brendan, based on what I showed you, how does this align to what you're expecting in terms of solving XYZ problem? And then I'm looking for a hard yes, a hard no, or something in between. If it's a hard yes, this is exactly what we need, then what I've done at that point is you just micro close them. You just close them on that feature. And if you micro close them throughout the demo, you're essentially closing them throughout the entire process. If they say, yeah, I think so, there's hesitation. So you don't move on. In that case, you say, hey, Brendan, I sense a little hesitation. What do you feel wouldn't work for you? Now, most salespeople actually don't look for problems. They don't look for resistance. They look for like, hey, what would work for you? Why does this work? I'm looking to see why this would be an objection. So I'm asking the prospect to share an objection with me. Why wouldn't this work for you? Another example of that would be when they say, I got to take this back to my boss, for example, or my VP or whatever it is. What you should ask them is, when you do take this back to your VP or your boss, or whatever it is, what concerns do you think they're going to have? What are they going to push back on? Again, I'm looking for problems. I want to hear objections while I'm still on the call. A third thing that I would recommend doing is, I'm a big believer in talking about price upfront, money upfront. But I'll give you 2 scenarios here. If you only show the price at the end of the call, at the end of the demo, then before you do that, what I'd recommend you do is, hey, Brendan, before we go into price and what the plans are, based on what I've showed you today, do you feel like this would work for you? Because if it doesn't, it may not even be relevant to show you price. It may just not be a fit. So I want to do that price gut check before I even go into price. If they say, yeah, sure, I'll go into price. If you're the type of person that likes to show up price in the beginning, or maybe they say, send me a proposal. I never send proposals without talking about price. So I'll say something like, hey, Brendan, before I even spend time on drafting a proposal and you spending time reading it, why don't I just tell you my rates? You let me know more or less if this would work for you. If it doesn't, then it may not make sense to meet up on Monday or share my proposal. I get permission. They say yes. I then share my rates. So those are like very tactical things that you can do that creates very radical transparency on the call.
I like that a lot. I think it's I like how practical it is. I like the idea of it puts the power in the hands of the reps to do. I think the qualification, disqualification, which kind of sounds scary to disqualify a deal, but like hope isn't a strategy, and so you might as well have that upfront contract kind of conversation, if you will, to understand, what is this truly an opportunity or not? And I think so often reps default to a monologue versus a dialogue, where they just talk and they talk and they talk and they talk and they talk, and they don't ask those questions. And whether that's, I'd love to hear the kind of, why do you think? So you're kind of saying, hey, this is what you should do. Why don't reps do this? Is that because of like conflict avoidance, or what's driving that lack of? I don't say lack of ability, lack of execution.
Yeah, I think one reason is they don't know how to be direct without being impolite, and so they just avoid the question entirely because they don't want to like step on anyone's toes. I think that's one reason. Number two, they're scared to plant a seed in the prospect's mind. So if they call out like, "Hey, what concerns do you have about what I just showed you?" or "Who else on your team will push back on this idea?" That's a question that pretty much opens up a can of worms, like opens up a cans of like objections, and they don't want to plant the seed. Like, don't bring that up. Don't talk about competitors. Don't talk about price or objections, and they don't do that. I think those are the two reasons. And number three, maybe they don't know what they don't know. And like who would ask? Like earlier in my life when I got into sales, I didn't know to ask these questions. Um, but I think a lot of times if they do learn that they should ask these questions, they don't know how to without being impolite. So I guess a tactical way where you can ask a direct question without being impolite is what I like to call vulnerable disclaimers. So it'll sound something like, let's say I want to ask you a very direct question, but like I fear it's going to be too direct, too blunt. I'm going to ask permission. I'm going to say, "Hey, Brendan, I have a pretty blunt question to ask you. Is it okay if I ask you? And feel free to kick me in the teeth."
Yeah.
And then you'll most likely give me a yes, and then I'll ask my direct question.
Yeah, we were talking. I had, in the last interview I had, like I said, hey, what are talking about the three biggest traits for successful sales reps, and it was humility and vulnerability, or two of those, and it speaks into that. I like the idea of I think you said vulnerable disclaimer, right?
Yeah.
And asking for permission is a way, to your point, to be humble and vulnerable. And I think there's also an element where, when you talk about look out for problems, where that humility and vulnerability can come into play is, even if they tell you a problem you don't know, I think that it's okay. I mean, my view on it's okay if you don't know the answer, and just say, hey, that's a great question. How do I get back to you and give you an answer? If you don't know, the worst thing you do is just make up an answer that's completely wrong. Obviously, you want to have the confidence and the knowledge to be able to execute it. But I do think there's an element of trust that you can gain with a buyer to say, let me come back to you with a response after I've had a chance to connect with the right people internally.
How do you feel about saying "I don't know"?
I'm okay if it's connected to, but here's what I'm going to do. What I don't like is I don't know, and then you just leave it there. And so I think that it needs to be, I don't know, but here's what I'm committing to do, and you give them that action plan. I think buyers respond to that well. How about you?
I don't know. I don't like it. I can see why buyers would respond to it, but I try to put myself in a buyer seat, and if I'm about to spend $60,000, $100,000 or whatever it is on a product, and the answer I get is "I don't know, but I'll get back to you," it's like you should expect to know, right? Like that's like the buyer ego. But so you said something in the beginning earlier that I liked. It was like, "Let me get back to you on that." You're saying "I don't know" without saying "I don't know," and I think that's a better approach.
I agree. And I think to your point, it probably depends on what the topic is. Like when I was saying that, I was thinking more I'm thinking more mid-market, where you have a specific, like a question around functionality of your software. And I think it's like that. That's where I'm like, hey, you probably need a sales engineer for that question. And it's like, let me get back to you, and here's what I'm going to do. I think that, but if it's like straightforward things that like you should know, to your point, it's like, well, we're done. Like, let me be honest with you, I'm not buying from you. So I think there's that element that you can get yourself in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Mor, let's as we kind of final lap question. I've really enjoyed this dialogue and thinking through like how do we run more effective demos. I think it's not only a higher win rate, but I think there's a velocity component here that you just brought up in terms of if you have those upfront conversations, you likely will move deals faster, not just win them at a higher rate, but actually at a faster sales cycle.
Yeah. Can I share one other
Oh, yeah.
tactic around that?
Yeah.
So one of the things that most sales reps should ask is like around the timeline, like when they would want to at least start solving that problem or implementing the solution. And the prospect gives them a particular date, next quarter, next month, whatever it is. Most reps just take a note and be like, all right, great, cool. Now they have the timeline. What you should be doing is what I call unselling, where it's almost like you're telling the prospect, hey, you don't need this right now. So why do you need it so quickly? And I'll give you an example. I ask you, hey, when do you need to implement this by or start the process by? You say next, this month, mid-month. My advice is to say, well, curious, why not later? And when you ask that, the prospect ends up telling you why they actually need it sooner. Or they may say, well, you're right, actually, we don't need, but most of the time they'll really tell you why they need it sooner. So that's another little tactic.
Interesting. I've never done that way. I have done the kind of the work backwards concept. Okay, well, if you want to by this date, well, here's what we need to make sure we do to ensure that you have it in place and your team is actually using it to drive urgency. But that's a different approach too of just saying, why not later? For them to the same concept. It accelerates the urgency in their mind.
Yep, exactly.
All right, Mor. Well, as we were saying, if our audience wants to learn more about some of these tips, tricks, not necessarily hacks, but ways in which they can partner with you to help their sales team, what's the next step they can take?
The best thing is go to my website, demotoclose.com, and it has all the information there. And if you want to chat and see if we can partner up, then my calendar link is there. We can book a time.
All right. And like I said earlier in this podcast, we'll be sure to provide some of those questions that Mor uses. I think that'd be a really helpful asset for our audience. But please reach out to him. He's a good follow on LinkedIn. As you mentioned, he likes to do a lot of writing. And there's a lot you can learn and get value from by following Mor on LinkedIn. So Mor, thanks so much. Really do appreciate it. And let's stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give you the link. It's 24 discovery questions to quantify pain. That you'll get the whole thing. It's free. So I'll send that to you.
Sweet. All right. Thank you so much.